dance, and she will think through it within the broader context of colonization. And then we will have a third presentation by Sonia Medel, who is a doctoral student in the Department of Educational Studies, who will also pick up another aspect of dancing in relation to the embodied Latino diaspora perspectives on dance and how dance is positioned in relation to Decolonization. I will be taking notes and hopefully will be able to give some meaningful comments. Thank you very much. So we will start with Xiao, and Lucy, and then Sonia.
Hi everyone, my name is Xiao. I think I should have PowerPoint.
Yeah, we have a second.
So that's fine. I'll just start while we're working on the PowerPoint. I guess for me today to be here to share with you maybe the idea of Chinese pride and how it's related to decolonization is for me it's not an ultimate experience, and I think it's even a little bit awkward because it's challenging because while the term itself, decolonization, came to me, or as I approached that term, mainly in Anglophone higher education, and which itself is a great limitation, I think. And also, when I reflect on my own part of my education in the Sinophone culture, and I don't know how to translate that term. Of course, as like the keynote speaker mentioned, it's a little bit conceptual confusion. And so I guess my focus today will be more about a grounded perspective on how, what kind of knowledge do I have, do my family have? So this is, yeah, thank you. And from a more embodied perspective, so to speak. Because when Handel invited me to come here to share my perspective, I actually talked to one of my friends in a university in Singapore who studied Chinese history, and I asked him a question. So how do you translate that term, decolonization, from, the Han Chinese history and culture perspective? And he didn't know the answer. Of course, you could have the very direct translation, 去殖民化, and which doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I decided, I brought some things, I brought some gingers here. Ginger, I brought eggplants, I brought the lotus roots. The reason I brought those things because, when I thought about term decolonization, actually I thought about those things because those things are where I grew up, and it's really a mountain village where it's really good for growing those vegetables, gingers, eggplants, even lotus roots. And I thought about food. And so this is I'm not going to talk about that, but these are some of the ideas that originally came to me when I heard the term decolonization, or maybe I could unpack some of those concepts, some of the very Western-centric perspective, actually. So lots of scholars, maybe they're really interested in studying one of those maybe political events, historical conjunctures, cultural transformations, and also from a very Sinophone-centric perspective as well. And all those things are very much book knowledge or textbook knowledge. And I don't think I'm knowledgeable enough to talk about those ideas at that level, mostly the academic level, which sometimes could be a little bit colonizing itself. So I think my talk today, I have the inspiration from some of the people here. So there's an intellectual called Fei Xiaotong, who's an anthropologist as well as sociologist, who's used to study with the famed anthropologist Malinowski in UK. And he has this idea, Sinophone idea, of course, very Sinocentric, of cultural reflexiveness, about how you realize your own cultural position. And also a writer here, Sen Chongwen, who's, I read a lot of his words about how do you learning in the world, how do you learning from the grassroots cultures where he came from, and where I think partially I came from. And also lots of those articulable knowledge from my neighbors, my friends, my families, and my folks who live in the mountain areas. And so this will be, I'll be sharing the moments of my own migration journey. And from that multi-ethnic Cantonese mountains to the Pearl River Delta, and later, much later, to here, to the Coast Salish waterfronts in Vancouver and Richmond. So I start by first showing a picture here, and this is the place where I came from. And this is 1920s, and the picture at the bottom is 1980s. And you can see the mountains, the river, and of course this is my family here, and my grandmother, my mother, my two older cousins, and I think the little one here, this one, that's me. And so I guess the point is, well, my grandmother, her family came to the mountain during the war in the early 1990s, early mid-1930s, during the Sino-Japanese War. They came to the mountains because the mountain protected us from the war. And so they built relationships with people living in the mountains for many generations. And what you cannot see here in the picture is my grandfather, who was in a farming village in the mountains where they produce a lot of ginger. And also my father, who's in another village where they produce a lot of eggplants. So I think these things always make me think about, to the extent of where we identify as a people, and I don't know what's the name. There isn't even a name. I mean, maybe to some extent Cantonese, but not really. It's really multi-ethnic. So, but the mountains, of course, are not just mountains, but also a place where we grew a lot of vegetables, where every year we went to the mountains to worship our ancestors. And the rivers are not just rivers, but also the rivers where my grandmother and mother, they grew up. They learned to swim, they learned to drink, they learned to rinse rices, wash clothes, and they learned to teach. They become teachers in one of the schools in the mountains. They teach, I think actually they teach mathematics and chemistry, which is very, very much scientific, so to speak, in that area. So this was our life, and I think this is still the life of many people. And we're pretty proud of growing in vegetables, and this is just a picture I think I took a couple of years ago in the river village where you just saw in the previous picture. And still lots of people growing vegetables, and I just picked on some of the expressions, very ordinary expressions people are talking about in that area. You know, growing vegetables and relaxing in the winter sunlight, as you can see from the picture at the bottom left. And they're playing a game called mahjong, which is quite common in East Asian culture, but of course it has a very unique expression in that region. And also the bottom right, where you could see senior women with children walking to the market. And so these are very ordinary experiences. And one of the thing of the issue in all those things is mostly senior women and children who were left behind in mountain villages. And it's another term, Diufong, which is agricultural land being abandoned. And a lot of people, you can see the missing generations, probably one generation, even two generations, like people like my two older cousins you see in the previous picture. They actually went down from the mountains to the delta in the hope of making a fortune, and actually being able to return with a fortune, with new knowledge, what they think as useful skills and knowledge, and bring it back. So Lok Harbin is a very common term. If you went to that region, you hear a lot of people talk about, okay, they say are you, Lahaping, are you going down from the mountains to the delta areas? And I think it's a very long process. I think many years ago I was one of those who are perhaps fortunate enough to actually go down and to have to receive different education. And this is the picture here is me. It's, I think in the 80s. Is waiting for. I think that it was taken on my birthday. I think it's a birthday cake. I forgot who gave me the birthday cake, but actually it's me who's waiting for buses, actually waiting for a new kind of education. And I think one of my strongest memories was listening to the mountain winds, and you're listening to the bus engines when they came, and also the fact that, well, we actually had electricity in the 80s, and so we have TV, we're listening a lot of TV shows. I used to turn listening because sometimes people are not watching, because maybe the whole village will have only one TV, and then a lot of people would just went to that small store, and some of those is listening to whatever sounds came from that TV program. But behind all this was the idea of listening to news, to a new kind of new sounds from the outside world. I mean, new education. The idea that there's nothing really valuable in that region, which was not true, but I mean listening not in a sense of active listening, but really a very passive kind of receiving what people are telling you was valuable. You should learn some useful things in order to live. So from rural to the cities and new noises, I made a lot of friends in one of those internet bars in China, actually, where you have lots of all kinds of people. Youth went to internet bars because they don't have other places to go to, and it's a relatively affordable places for them to really have fun there, to make friends. And so many years later, I think I was able to talk to, I think, doing a research with all the migrant children in Guangzhou and Shenzhen, which are two mega cities in southern China. And I think a lot of their experiences really resonate with my own memories. And so I wrote this essay, Who Needs Cantonese, Who Speaks? Mainly it's about the idea that how we are able to share our stories, and who cares about our stories anyway. And I think there's one thing I really want to mention here. I think the idea of Cantonese, I think right here at UBC, there's, of course, we have a program of Chinese studies, but also we have a new program of Cantonese studies, actually, also Hong Kong studies. I think a lot of people have the idea or perception that when you think of Cantonese, you will think, oh, is it about Hong Kong? But no, not really. And in fact, I think it's a mistake to think only Cantonese is about Hong Kong. I think from the region where I came from, we also have a claim on Cantonese, but also, and we think the Hong Kong people, they came to mountain as oppressors. Of course, we think the Chinese states are also one of the oppressors, but the Hong Kong people also. So we have a very different idea of a more mixed mountain Cantonese identity, and sometimes I feel there's over-representation of that. When you get the academic debates in a higher education institutional context, you have that, well, Hong Kong identity being the one and only representation of that Cantonese identity. And here I will just show a video clip by my mother, who's speaking a particular kind of Cantonese, speaking with a woman who's living in that river village, and who's also speaking another kind of, language. I couldn't see it. time. Okay, I think that's fine. So maybe we could, I think I'll just skip that because there's no sound from here. But I think my main point is it's really difficult to tell those stories without a lot of people being interested in knowing those very different identities, those nuanced expressions, nuanced ways of life in here. And that village where I show in the very first picture is changing a lot because the real estate developments, because of the chemical factories in that area is polluting the river. And you could see the woman working by her village with herbicides, actually killing one of those plants. I think many years ago, the people there used it as a medicine, actually, as a medicine to heal a kind of brain disease. But now, well, she's working with herbicide to actually kill that plant because of, the land needs to be developed for a park or for real estate projects. So things are changing, and this is later when I came here. I think food is one of the things that connect me to a lot of people, maybe here in the Chinese community or in the Chinatown area. So some of those things, this is one of the soup that I made, and pour with ginger, with peanuts, with green beans and lotus roots. Is a kind of sort of family soup that I remember. And a lot of friends, they're in Chinatown and they really like it. So I just put some terms here as a way to say that, well, food and lots of those things about cultural heritage really, in a way, connect us. And this is also a calendar. It's a food recipe that my own family recipe, and in collaboration with an artist working in the Chinatown area. So a lot of the things we did together is about that sense of pride in Chinatown, which most often is about those embodied things, food. About, I think a few months ago there was an event that I worked with an artist called Paul Wong, who's doing the traditional Cantonese opera, and it's a kind of gender expression, primarily for the purpose of building intergenerational connections. But it's also a kind of reflection that some of our friends are saying that maybe Chinatown should not be trendy because it's not just something that you do just for you to post it on Instagram, but it's really more about basic livelihoods, people, about the food, about affordable housing, about the land, and it's especially important, and that's a conversation I had with a lot of friends there. It's about, well, it's about how do you want to do with the land in Chinatown on Cold Salish lands. I remember last year there's huge controversy. There's a building in Chinatown, Kiefer 105, and we're in the city hall. There's a huge debate about what do you want to do with that lot, Kiefer 105. And a lot of activists asking for that place for a building to have affordable housing for lots of low-income seniors, low-income populations. But at the same time, there's a very uneasy relationship with somewhat masculine communities, and which have different ideas of allowing that for real estate development to a particular real estate developer. So it's a very uneasy conversation. It's very difficult. And I think I'm also supposed to talk a little bit about some of the intellectual ideas of in relation to decolonization, some of those Sinophone investments into thinking differently. And so I just list some of the names here. For example, Fei Xiaotong, who's talked about cultural reflexiveness from his lifelong work in China, mostly in rural China, about as a Han Chinese person, how do you see the different ethnicities, their ways of life? How do you deal with those huge cultural as well as industrial transformation from to the modern cities, basically? So his way of cultural reflexiveness, and also Wang Hui here. Some people call him sort of new Marxist thinker, and he's thinking something about how to combine Marxist thinking to decolonization, and also Sun Ge, who's doing a lot of work basically in Japanese studies, but thinking about the idea of Asia as different from the West. Thinking about the idea of Asia based on her research in Japanese studies. So I think I'm trying to say that, well, I got a lot of those things from higher education, in Sinophone and Anglophone education, and sometimes I don't know what to do with them. And politically, more particularly, there's probably you've heard the idea of Chinese Dream, One Belt, One Road, as ideas by the Chinese politicians in China about how to promote China to the world. In fact, some people will call it, well, it's a kind of building an empire. Some people will call it, some of my friends will call it, especially the One Belt, One Road, about different Chinese enterprises, state-owned enterprises going to different parts of the world to build infrastructures, to huge investment projects. And most recently, I read an article where two Chinese intellectuals having a dialogue with Walter Mineral, who's from South America. So there is dialogues going on in terms of decolonization, but most oftenly I was thinking about its relevance to the very ordinary context. What's the meaning of decolonization in a mountain village? And this is a picture I taken in that ginger village where lots of people in the winter they will preserve the meats, and that's one of their cultural heritage. And lots of people will ask, the kids will ask, often ask, when is the meat ready? And so this is the things I think about when I heard the term decolonization. I always trying to think, how do we do things at a very grassroots level? And the big ideas are useful. But yes, when is the meat ready? So this is another picture I took in that ginger village. You can see the dogs, you see the motorbikes. So the motorbikes, lots of people use it to communicate with the world. And the world is coming to the mountain as well. Nowadays, we have lots of tourism to explore the histories and culture of those ancient villages, but also lots of international festivals. So things are changing, and I think today I'm just use maybe the 10-15 minutes to share my own stories related to the topic of decolonization, my migration journey. And I think last but not least, I remember what I learned in reading literatures about decolonization is also about changing a frame of reference. So I think I just put I think I have to listen to the intellectual ideas that some of this in the Sinophone cultures, but also I have to listening to my friends and neighbors and folks who really they have their own useful knowledges. I think for me, this is the first step towards decolonization. And thank you for listening.
André?
I hear you perfectly well.
Okay.
And we see you perfectly well.
Okay, thanks everyone. It's been a pleasure to engage these three presentations, or rather perhaps performances of sorts. Anyway, there is much to say. I'll try to pick up a few points that I think deserve further attention. And in a way, I'll scramble them, all of them. I'm not going to go this presentation by presentation, but rather identify some themes and then show how it played out in various dissertations. I'm very grateful to the presenters because in many, many ways, each one of them and some many more who are not with us today have been very significant teachers to me in that area in which I've been dragged a few years ago, starting with the same students I've been working with, and I'm grateful to them for this opportunity and for the sharing of the work. I'll start by saying something about the colonial, and in that sense, take it as a point of departure to speak to the various presentations. I appreciated the concept of nested colonialisms, and I think that showed up in all three of them, whether Xiao's presentation about his own experiences between his village and downtown China, capacity to tell stories, to tell one's narrative, etc. Whether it is by Lucy's presentation about the multiplicity of ways through which a particular performance is being claimed and reclaimed and counterclaimed, and definitely in Sonia's presentation about the diversities that play, racialization and the kind of diversity that plays into the performance of dance. And that for me is a very significant point, this idea of nested colonialism, because it shows that the colonial as a phenomenon, it should be conceived rather in terms of its pluralities. And these are pluralities that coexist at a point in time, but also coexist across time. So there are kind of two vectors to it. Temporal vectors, a constant present, and I'll be speaking about that later on, but also over time. And I think the three presentations show the complexity and challenges that face, by implication, that face any decolonial theory or theorizing and any decolonial praxis. Is that ability to navigate, to negotiate that complexity and its multifaceted aspects to it. That's the first point. The second point more specifically talks about decolonial theorizing and decolonial praxis. Is connected with the complexity of actually determining the bounds of decolonial work and of decoloniality. And by bounds, I mean to say, as we have seen through all three of the presentations, starting from Ginger Village, through the Dabke, through the dance, Latin American dance in Vancouver, and the complexities it brings, what we have is a dynamic that involves, in full scale, the human experience. And the human embodied experience, its tactility, the sounds, the emotions, the tastes, the rage, all of that enters into the decolonial process. And I learned from that something very important. And I think I heard a little bit of the first keynote that, yeah, decolonial work is not just a metaphor. It involves and entails and commends the totality of one's experience. And I would like to spend just to spend a minute on two elements of that. The embodied dimension, and as I think it was Lucy who mentioned, the tactility of the decolonial praxis. and theorizing texts. I think it is very important to capture the idea that decolonial work involves as well a reclaiming of one's body in terms of its movements. I do not mean to say the muscular possibilities involved by deploying one's arms and bodies, because these are determined by the maximum amount of space we can reach out to. But that capacity to reinvest one's body with movement as narrative. I think we've seen that in the contrast between black and white in The Last Dance by Sonia, and the masks as well. But the capacity to deploy one body over a space that goes beyond the limitations, the erasures, and the limitations imposed by colonial power. The second one is the notion of tactility. As an important component of learning solidarity. Tactility as touch, but tactility also as a medium for acquiring new knowledge, for getting to know, to feel the other, not just as another who is idealized in one's mind, but another who is an embodied presence in my life, and asking the question, what are the implications of that encounter for decolonial work? The third comment that I would like to provide, and then perhaps we can open it for questions, is the centrality of culture. I appreciated that quote contrasting the power of culture with the culture of power. And I appreciate it in decolonial thought particularly because in the way it has been approached in all three presentations, culture goes beyond the mere definition that anthropologists would give to it. It becomes a site that does not necessarily delve in relation to tradition and reclaiming it in a pure way. It's not about reproducing what has been lost, but it is about generating new possibilities, new imaginations, and new embodied manifestations, new forms of meaning that interrogate the relationships that bring people together in a particular context. And I would conclude by saying I appreciated Xiao's point about how would you translate decolonizing in a particular language. And I think the problematic that Xiao pointed out to would be valid when we think about decolonizing even in other languages than Mandarin or Cantonese or any other language. And I think it is very important to think about that because it means in many ways, and we have seen indications of that in each of the three presentations, is that decolonizing cannot operate as a template generated in one center and then propagated to all kinds of other places to make people aware. What I learned from these three presentations is that any notion of decolonizing must emerge from within the colonial situation, the colonial condition, and then think how it seeks to name the decolonial moment. And the naming means, in many ways, being capable not just of understanding, but at the end of the day, to capture meanings that have not been there and which now might give me some power to move onward. So thank you very much for the three presentations. I think I've taken 10 minutes from that, and we can now open the questions and answer session. Thank you.
Okay, so could I, you see, might be a bit of a problem. Could I ask the three of you to sort of come forward? We're eating into lunchtime, but you won't eat.
If you could come on this side, the camera would be better.
Oh.
On what side? On the right side? On this, I mean, middle or side.
Thanks, the three of you, for your presentations. I want to just, these are issues I'm also wondering about myself. So I just wanted to know what you think about them, and I'll address a question to each of you. So you can choose not to say anything because it's just something I'm thinking about. For Xiao, in your presentation, you discussed food, ginger farming and all that, but also how this presents an opportunity to look at decolonization, especially in the diaspora. So now my thinking is this: how should we think perhaps about the relationship between the commercialization of food and the quest for decolonization, which is supposedly a quest that aims at something more authentic, a way of thinking about the self, reconstituting the self. So thanks for the presentation about that. In your presentation, I saw the creativity of culture, right? And how we can use that to further the whole cause of decolonization. Now, I was just wondering, why is it, first of all, can this kind of creativity that happens in the cultural sphere teach us something about the political sphere? Because it often happens that there is enormous energy and creativity going on in the sphere of culture in many post-colonial states or societies, even in the diaspora. But that hardly translates to the political sphere. I don't know, are there things we should pay attention to in order to realize some kind of, to perhaps find a way to transport some of the lessons from the cultural sphere to the political sphere. Then finally, I was thinking about dance as performance in your in the presentation, just the last one. What I was thinking about is the way that performance, as you know, dance as performance rather, the way that it could abate or aid the project of decolonization. That is, when you dance, you express something, but to express something through dance, you practice to perform. So that understanding of performance, how does it get recreated in what you do when you dance towards decolonization? Let me put it that way. But otherwise, I enjoyed your presentations. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I was just thanks for that question. I think that's something also I've been thinking about, because I think food, the way I mentioned food, is essentially about knowledge. The way you think of knowledge in terms of superiority and inferiority, because I think I've been growing up in a context where the reason a lot of people, they were going down from the mountains to other areas because they think they don't have any useful knowledge. And also those things that they know how to grow vegetables, they know how to make food, have been denied. And they need to look for new things, new skills to make a living. And so that's one way to think about food and why it's important for decolonization, so to speak. But as you mentioned, well, commercialization, I think there are at least several ways of commercializing it. I think in the mountains, well, one way to think about it is, well, people selling their food to lots of merchants, which support their own life, which is good. But when I came here, and I first learned the term organic food and community gardening, and lots of those terms And I think that was the moment when I would call it moments of colonization, because those terms, they were taking power away from those food knowledge. And again, I have to learn about what does community gardening mean, what does organic food mean. And all of those things were there in the area where I came from, but people don't call them in those ways. And you have you have to learn a new discourse, so to speak, and you lost your power. I would say that's the moments where I become particularly vigilant, because that's the moment where I feel inferior. I feel I am ignorant. I think that's the moment I think about decolonization.
I just want to share that the Sustenance Festival, and I have to give props to all of these racialized peoples that organize this. They said, kind of let's take out this language that you were talking about, like organic this and that, and they collected storytellers from different parts of Africa, from Colombia, they're all elders, Cis from here, so First Nations, to talk about food and cultivation practices outside of those terms, in resistance to very hegemonic dynamics that unfold in our city with gardening and the food and the whole industry, like the food and beverage industry.
Just to build on that a little bit, this idea, and I really love this idea that you point out, where you hear the word organic and you hear the word community gardening. It's like, what is that? That's what we've always been doing. Just personally, the first time I went to the Middle East, I was a girl. I was living in England at the time, and I was bizarrely noticed that folks walking around in Egypt did not have plastic bags. This was in the early 80s. And folks they had these strange mesh bags that they used to carry their groceries. And I thought that was completely bizarre. Fast forward to the late 80s, plastic bags came to Egypt and everyone was enamored with them, and now we had to pay 10 cents to use, or 10 piastres to use plastic bags. And then fast forward to, 2010, I think, which was when plastic bags started getting phased out. So now what do we have? We have a situation in Egypt where people are using plastic bags thinking it's this like great Western invention. Meanwhile here, they're using reusable bags. And it blows my mind how the adoption of Western ontologies and epistemologies has taken over and erased. It's not to say that they're wrong, it's just as Sylvia Winter would say, it's like they're over-representation, right? How they've erased and pushed out locally grown and indigenous ways of knowing and being that were not always necessarily perfect, but that were grounded and rooted. So to kind of swing that back to the question you asked me, which I think was, what do you think about this distinction between political and cultural? I would argue that these are, for me, what becomes more and more obvious is that these distinctions between political and cultural are also another Western construct, because cultural, in terms of dancing dabke, is always political. Even though the people dancing it would argue otherwise, they would say, we don't want anything to do with politics. We distinctively position ourselves as not doing anything to do with politics. But you're dancing a Palestinian dance. You're a Palestinian person. According to some people, you are not supposed to exist. So the act of dancing dabke, or the act of saying I'm Palestinian, that in itself is a huge political statement. I don't remember the rest of your question, but I hope that answers what you were asking.
Oh, I'll try to answer. So I think there's intentional and unintentional in the power of dance or performance as being decolonial, decolonizing, and resistance. And I think I think that it's always there, definitely always there. Like I think that the maestros that I've had with an ex in Peru and in Chile and in Mexico and here with different forms of power are going on these big, political speeches telling me to resist, right? But there's, again, storytelling involved in the movement of everything from the arms, acknowledgements of the land, to meanings of, the sun and the moon. And there's also stuff in the costumes involved. So for example, my use of that one is that became a very nationalist costume for La Marinera Limeña. In La Marinera Limeña, I was taught as a child, and somehow it was glossed over, it had roots that were both, they say indigenous, because there's supposedly guys called Samacueca and then the Huacos, and these things you found uncovered and underneath the earth, there's etchings of people in positions related to the dance. And there's another story that it came from Semba, so from Afro-descendant dances, right? Possibly through Brazil. So there's these very strong connections of empowerment for the woman, of reproduction, of sexuality and sensuality that I was learning as a very small child. And somehow in my teens, in this Canadian setting, I forgot, right? So I came to re-own that as a young woman, I guess. But also in the unintentional, in this one dance group, we shy away, we explicitly say it's a traditional dance group because we have members from different classes and different races and ethnicities. And I think that our biggest learnings are around through resources and through like the everyday slang, right? So it's inner small relationships where, for example, a friend that I've had since childhood who's visibly white Peruvian will say words like, oye, si esa danza negroide, that negroid dance, right? Or oye, ay, chola. And chola is a very derogatory term for somebody that's indigenous, right? So we begin, those of us that have been working with different leaders back home, or I guess more explicitly politicized, saying like, hey, you know, why do you use that word still, right? Like, we're laughing, but why are we laughing about it? And then learnings about resources here in Vancouver, for example, through the praxis of asking someone to book a room, we realize what this creative strategy is all about. We still have to be able to pocket out of our money, memberships between 50 to 100 or more to book studios. I don't have that kind of money, right? It's per hour. Or we go through hoops and hoops and hoops where different racialized groups are standing there in a lineup on standby to access a beautiful studio, right? And that's a lesson that somebody from a certain class never would have gotten unless they were having to go through the mechanisms, right? So I hate always saying like dance is resistance, but I feel like the power, there's so much power in that, right? And hegemonically it has been used by powerful groups as well. So it's just finding how to take it back.
Kokila had a question.
Okay. I have a short thought rather than a question. In coming from South Africa, dance was also used by the ruling powers to depoliticize people. In other words, they became part of the selling of the tourist, the ethnic, and so on and so forth. Now my question is, I found very beautiful what you were doing with it and the way in which you emphasize the power element. And that's well and good, and it's really important. But there's also, it's important aspect that I see is group valorization and coming together around the notion of rediscovering who the we are and the power of what we are and so on, identity issues. How do you then transcend the group-specific nature of this project as opposed to something broader that in decolonization we have to extend that, we have to build bridges. How do you transcend? I see it as a very important step, but how do you transcend the absorptive power and the inward turning power of it as opposed to moving further with it? If you see in South Africa, I think there's one thought came to my mind, the whole business of toy-toying, where they dance as a form of protest, forms a bridge between indigenous forms and forms of taking it to at the risk of being crude, an instrumental process, that is, voicing their disagreement. It also extends that form not only to Africans, but whites are trying in very awkward ways to dance with the toy-toying. And I find those processes would be quite interesting to pursue. Anyway, a thought.
If I could respond to that a little bit.
Sure.
I agree with you that there is a real problem with this idea of valorization of particular dances and what they mean and what they represent. But I would disagree with, because I think it's really important to hold on to the specificity of the unique context. Because if I want to jump from the particularity of dabka done in the GTA or on Turtle Island to a more broader concept of decolonization, then for me, it's like saying the only constant is change. For me, the only thing that I could generalize from the specificity of doing DACA in the GTA for the Greater Toronto Area is the fact that we need to always be attentive to the specifics of the situation and how it interpolates particular social relations. So doing DACA on Turtle Island is not the same as doing belly dancing on Turtle Island. Those are two very, very different dance contexts. And whereas at one point I really have been a proponent of thinking about how do I think about decolonization in a broader way, I'm coming more and more to appreciate the careful unpacking and unthreading and looking at how this one specific context is connected to the general in so many other ways. In my view, only from there can then I begin to generalize. But yeah. But I agree with you that the valorization is a problem. But for these people doing this dance at this time and place, they need that for particular reasons that aren't replicated by Egyptians doing belly dancing, for example.
Yeah, I was going to say kind of to work to all of our relations, to work with co-Salish learning, which is we are all of our relations, right? We have to clean up the messiness at home. And that's, I feel like, what's missing in diaspora work, right? So it is an awareness of the broader, but really making sure that you're attending to the diaspora issues, which is where I feel I have an issue with anything that's like a big paradigm proliferation or like talking about the grandness of decolonial theory, right? Because it was put out there, right? Without people attending to what the issues, the racial issues, the class issues, the myriad of intersectional issues that were happening in the different contexts, because it's not also one pan Latin America in my case, right? It's many different countries and cultures. So, I mean, I definitely feel like the people that I'm working with here in Vancouver are attending to their diaspora politics and dynamics, really hard ones, like really messy hard ones, and working outside as well.
Thank you all three for your presentations. I think there was such a beautiful weaving of kind of the complexity and the diaspora identities are marked in this complexity because of the histories and the representations that are linked with them. And I just want to tie this decolonial kind of project back to the context of it, which is the nation state. So what, I grapple with this, welcome your thoughts around how do we engage with these diaspora identities against the backdrop of both an official policy of multiculturalism and a cultural and social expectation of multiculturalism, and in the current climate of reconciliation. Does that mean that we have to re-articulate what we mean by diaspora identity? Do we have to re-articulate how we take up the project of nation, what it means to be a citizen? So I just want to hear how you're grappling with those and kind of any thoughts with respect to the nation and decolonization, what you do.
Yeah, maybe I'll just go first. I think when you mentioned the term nation state, I was actually thinking which nation state? Is it Canadian state or, because I'm thinking Canadian state, but also the Chinese state. And I think they're somehow related as well as, at least in my own journey, I think, well, on coast Salish lands here, in relation to Canadian state, I think a lot of, I'll just give you very specific examples, maybe instead of theorizing it. But a lot of my friends in China, they are very much affiliated with the Canadian nation state, so to speak. They think they're really local-born Chinese Canadians. They're very much supportive of Canadian nation building, while also having a relationship with indigenous people. And I was considered actually, in the very margin of that community, in the Chinese community, because I'm not from those clans, those kinship associations. And they recognize me to the extent that while I speak the language I speak, maybe some kind of Cantonese, the food I made, the soup I made, maybe kind of resonate with their experiences of their own cultural heritage. So I think to that extent, I was connected to that Canadian nation state, maybe, and also, well, in terms of Chinese state, and I think I mentioned in the presentation that while a lot of people think Cantonese is about Hong Kong, which is not true. I think Hong Kong, Chinese days, to me, to a lot of people in my area, they're both oppressors. We are still looking for who we are, how to define ourselves, how to validate our knowledge, our ways of life. We don't think that any meaning who listen to our stories. So I guess that's my answer to your question.
Do you want to go? Okay, I want to respond to that. And my short answer to your question is very, very carefully. Because, so I gave you the example of during Canada 150, there was a motion that was passed at Dalhousie University that was led by a young brown Muslim, visibly Muslim, muhaggaba, hijabi wearing young woman. And she advocated for a motion that Dalhousie University should not celebrate Canada 150 because it is a celebration of Indigenous genocide. And she ended up getting censured by the university. She was viciously attacked in the media. And the arguments that were made against her were quite consistent. Who the hell are you anyway? You don't belong here. Go back to where you come from. If you don't like Canada 150, then don't be a part of it. There are things that I cannot say. I'm white passing, very white passing. I completely own that. But there are things I cannot say. I'm not white. There are things my community cannot say. That's what I meant by when I was saying our belonging is very precarious. All it takes is really not even one federal election to bring out a whole slew of proposed acts and legal statements that really put our unbelonging really that much closer to being severed entirely. So I would say very, very carefully, it's not easy. I'm not white. We can't say the things white people say. And that's why for me, that's why for me this idea of racialized settlerhood is a very, very different thing than talking about settlerhood, because it's constrained by so many other things. Sorry.
I think there's still time to chat and stuff. I wanted to make a sort of transition. We were supposed to, we're half an hour late. You're going to have to go with your lunch. No, but I think this has been a wonderful session from the keynote to the first panel. And I don't want to go over the points about the keynote, but I just wanted to sort of reiterate the points and what they brought up for me from this panel. Not so much the presentations, which were all really wonderful, and I think Andre did a great job in being discussant. But I'm just pointing to the questions that were raised, and the presenters gave answers, but it's stuff for us all to continue to think about. I think 3 really important questions. I think your point about who belongs in the decolonial project, right, and therefore who belongs in the nation when we're now decolonizing was a really important one, which gets to the politics of how this plays out. This is not always all positive. There are consequences for some groups that are considered other to the decolonial project. I think the idea that Kogila brought up about dance, and you guys gave very good answers to it. Still opens up the idea though that again sometimes the decolonial project becomes too circumscribed. It is for this group as opposed to that group. So how then should there be a reaching out beyond those groups that have identified themselves as engaging in the decolonial project without quote-unquote watering it down? I mean, what does white people dancing toy toy actually end up meaning, right? For me, I'm always been struck by the toy toy example. I told people when I went to South Africa, I mean, I'm African myself, but I don't know of other cultures that we dance for different things. We dance at a funeral, but this was the first time I was encountering people saying, I am so mad I could dance. I'm like, wow, that is, there's something about the politics of that dance as a form of protest that really strikes me. Not something that was a dance and now is seen as protest, but is born as protest. So you don't need to politicize it, it's already political, which was your point. But I think the third point about the nation state that Mayim brought up, to me, it just brings so much compare. And I liked your answer because we're always thinking of Canada immediately. So what about these other places that we're already thinking of as non-political? See, the further away we move from the original, the more we think, here's where the messiness happens. But the messiness is already there, right? There is no pristine African culture that you're going to recapture to be, that is going to inform your decolonization, nor Peruvian one, right? Nor Chinese one, right? But it becomes so much more complex in the diaspora. As I was listening to you all, I'm thinking, oh my God, it's one thing to do these arguments in Nigeria where Igbos are talking to Hausas and Yorubas, but it's a different thing when Igbos, Hausas, and Yoruba are somewhere in, in Etobicoke trying to talk about what it means to decolonize. So I just think this is becoming really complex, but I think the papers and the discussion, I think for me, have been really stimulating so far. And I want us to continue to think through these issues. So food for thought, and real food too. So let's take a break and have some lunch. And see if we can do it in half an hour. If not, we'll start a few minutes late. Okay, thank you so much.